For this lecture, we are going to discuss the anatomy of the nervous system. So we're going to be looking at directionality first, and then the major structures of the brain. First, we have to go over directionality. The reason for this is that when you read through the textbook or any kind of neuroanatomy text, you're going to encounter all of these different terms. So it's nice to at least have a basic understanding of the terms so that you can identify and visualize where the different brain areas are. Okay, so we'll start with dorsal. Dorsal means top. So like the top of a fish would be the dorsal fin, right? So dorsal's top, ventral is bottom, anterior towards the front. So your nose is anterior to your head, okay? Posterior would be towards the back. Medial would be towards the middle. Lateral towards the side or sides. And then proximal, close, distal, far. So your fingers are distal to your elbow. Your elbow is proximal to your hand, okay? Right? So if we look at these graphically, you'll notice that, let's go through these again. Dorsal, so dorsal, top of the head. Anterior would be your forehead, your nose, okay? Posterior, the back of your head. And then ventral would be at the base of the brain, okay? The bottom of the brain. And then over on the right-hand side, you have medial towards the middle, and then lateral towards the outside. So your ears would be lateral to your nose. Your nose would be medial to the ears. Okay. Also, you're going to run into a lot of the different sections of a brain. Okay, so you're going to be looking at a brain slice, and it'll be nice for you to know whether that is a coronal slice or a sagittal slice or a cross section. Okay. So the first one here is a horizontal plane, okay, and that is a slice parallel to the ground, okay. Frontal, also known as coronal, is like slicing bread, okay, through the brain. And then sagittal is a slice perpendicular to the ground, okay. And for instance, a mid-sagittal section would separate the left and the right hemispheres. So oftentimes you will see a mid-sagittal section of the brain and all the different structures in there. Those are probably the most popular, the most often occurring is going to be the mid-sagittal slice or plane, and then the coronal. All right, so let's talk about some of the major structures of the brain, starting with the protection of the brain. We already discussed that the central nervous system, right, is the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord are protected by the skull and the vertebrae, first and foremost, okay? And then the CNS is covered by three meninges. Okay? You have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and pia mater. So the dura mater is the tough outer membrane, the outermost membrane. The arachnoid mater is web-like, and that's where it gets the name arachnoid, like a spider. And then you have the pia mater, which is very fine and adheres to the surface of the CNS. And the reason why we're mentioning CNS here and not just brain is because the spinal cord also has the meninges around it. About 2/3 of the spinal cord is covered with these same meninges. Okay. Now you also have cerebral spinal fluid, CSF, that is produced by the choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles, and it serves as a cushion for the brain, but it also circulates nutrients and removes waste. Okay, and then lastly, there's a chemical protection for the brain as well, and that is called the blood-brain barrier. Now, the characteristics of this barrier is that these cells of the blood vessel walls are very, very tightly packed. And what that does is it prevents the entry of a lot of different molecules. Okay? So things that you put into the system are not all going to be psychoactive. They're not all going to be able to pass the blood-brain barrier. And that's very good because we're able to take substances into our body, medications into our body that are not going to be toxic for the brain because they can't pass through that blood-brain barrier. Okay, so let's look at these visually. In this picture, you're looking at the lateral ventricles. Remember, the choroid plexus is in the lateral ventricles, producing the cerebral spinal fluid. And the fluid runs from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle to the cerebral aqueduct, and then to the fourth ventricle to the central canal. Okay. And here you're looking at a sagittal view, okay? And then you're looking from the top, so like a dorsal view. Okay? So it's always good to practice those, that directionality that we just discussed. Okay, in this one, what I wanted to show you was all the different layers again of protection for the brain. So you have the scalp, then you have the skull, then you're looking at dura mater. Okay? In this case, you see that word meninx. Okay, that is singular for meninges. Okay, then you have arachnoid, the subarachnoid space where some of the CSF is in that space. Okay? And then you have the pia mater and the cortex is going to be the brain itself. Okay. All right, let's move on to the divisions of the adult human brain, broken up into forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Okay. We're going to start this whole story here with the hindbrain. So the hindbrain consists of the Myelencephalon and the Myelencephalon. The midbrain is the Mesencephalon, and then the forebrain is the Telencephalon and the Diencephalon. Okay. One way of memorizing these is that Telencephalon you can think of as top. The Diencephalon actually has the thalamus and hypothalamus, so there's only two. So you can think di as in two, Diencephalon. And then the other three are in alphabetical order. So you have Mesencephalon with the S, then T, Metencephalon, and then the Myelencephalon. So let's start with the Myelencephalon, where we find the medulla. Okay. Now, the medulla is the origin of the reticular formation, also named after its net-like visual characteristics. Okay, the reticular formation is specific for alertness and sleep. Okay. But the medulla overall also regulates cardiovascular system, respiration, and muscle tone. Okay. Now, I want to mention something right now. When we go through all of these brain areas, there's two main goals that I have for you. One of them is so that you can know how to pronounce the words. So when I am saying Myelencephalon, I want to make sure that it's very clear so that you can also practice saying these words. It's really hard to memorize or even recognize something that you can't pronounce. Okay, so that's my first goal. The second goal is to identify at least a couple functions for each part of the brain. And we're talking major structures. This is very, very much a gross anatomy. Okay? But in a lecture like this, I'm not able to go into a vast amount of detail for each brain area. So when you see, let's say, Metencephalon, okay, which is also part of the hindbrain, and I say pons, and we say, okay, it's responsible for sleep and respiratory rhythms. Okay? There are other things here. Okay? I'm just keeping it very, very simple, and I'm only providing you the major functions of each of these brain areas. Okay. All right, let's move along. So pons, sleep and respiratory rhythms, reticular formation, alertness and sleep. Now we saw the reticular formation in the Myelencephalon also. And that is true because it runs through the Myelencephalon, Metencephalon, and it will also run through the Mesencephalon. Okay. And then you have the cerebellum, which is performance of coordinated movements. So here's structures of the myelencephalon. So there you're looking at the medulla, the pons, the reticular formation running through, and you have the cerebellum. So all of these structures are very much dorsal in structures of the brain. So we're starting with the brainstem and working our way up. Okay, so now we're looking at mesencephalon or midbrain now. Two specific areas in the mesencephalon, the tectum and the tegmentum. Under tectum, we look at the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Okay. So superior colliculi is for vision, inferior colliculi is for audition. Under tegmentum, we have the reticular formation again. So again, sleep and arousal, right? Periaqueductal gray. The role here is in analgesia. Substantia nigra, part of the motor system. Red nucleus, part of the motor system. And the cerebral aqueduct runs through this structure. Okay. So again, the one term there that might catch you a little bit is the periaqueductal gray. Okay. And then we go on to the diencephalon. Now we're moving up to the forebrain. Here you have the thalamus, which is the switchboard. It identifies information and sends to the appropriate area in the cortex. Below the thalamus, and that's why it's called the hypothalamus, below the thalamus, you have behaviors of survival, so eating, drinking, and sexual behavior. Part of that hypothalamus is also the mammillary bodies, which are specific for memory. And we'll see mammillary bodies again in a little bit as it's associated with an entire brain system. Also in the diencephalon, you have the pituitary gland, which is responsible for hormone secretion, and its master is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, right, tells the pituitary gland what hormones to secrete. Okay? And then you have the optic chiasm also, which is the location where the optic nerves cross. And a lot of times what I've tried to do is really align these brain areas with what we're going to be talking about in this class. So when we discuss, for instance, the visual system, the optic chiasm is going to come in again. And so that's why I want to make sure that you understand approximately where it is in the brain. Okay. So now let's look at it pictorially, the mesencephalon. So look at there, you see the tectum consists of the inferior and superior colliculi. Okay. Colliculus would be singular for that. And then the tegmentum, you see the periaqueductal gray, you see the reticular formation running through it, you see the red nucleus, the substantia nigra, and then also the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so that is that cerebral spinal fluid flowing from those lateral ventricles down into the brainstem and spinal cord. And then the diencephalon. Remember, primarily here where we have the thalamus, and then right below the thalamus, you have the hypothalamus. Okay. And so you see how we're working our way up. So cerebellum, remember, was hindbrain, and then the pons on top of that, and then mesencephalon, and now we're to diencephalon, where we're looking at the thalamus and hypothalamus. And for this one here, I just want to give you a little bit better picture of the hypothalamus. Now it's broken up into all these different colors, and we will talk about some of these in subsequent chapters for specific function. Okay, but I want to show you where the hypothalamus was in relation to the optic chiasm and the pituitary gland. Okay, now we are up to the telencephalon. So remember, T for top, telencephalon. So here we have the cerebral cortex, which is the outermost layer of the cerebrum. And then you have the lobes of the cerebrum, the frontal lobe, which is specific for motor and complex cognitive functioning, temporal lobe for audition and language, parietal lobe for body sensations, and occipital for vision. Okay? So again, frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. Okay? We also have major fissures of the cerebrum. Now, a fissure is a deep furrow. So you can think of it like a groove in the brain. Okay? The brain is very wrinkled, okay? And we call those wrinkles convolutions. But each one of the little grooves is called a fissure and actually has a name. Okay, we're only going to go through and discuss 4 of those here. Okay, and then as those grooves come out and you see a little like hill or ridge, then those are going to be called gyri. Okay, so you have the central fissure, which separates the frontal and parietal lobes. You have the lateral fissure, which separates the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. The longitudinal fissure, which separates left and right hemisphere. And then the calcarine fissure, which separates the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Okay? And don't worry, we'll see all of this in a graphic. Okay? The major gyri of the cerebrum. Okay, now remember the plural or the singular of this would be gyrus. Okay, and these are the ridges. We only go over 3. The precentral gyrus is the motor cortex. We will be talking a lot about the motor cortex, so it's important for you to know where that's located. Okay, precentral gyrus. Postcentral gyrus is the somatosensory cortex. And then the superior temporal gyrus is the auditory cortex. Okay. And then the last thing on here is the corpus callosum, and that is the largest hemisphere connecting tract. So this is a series, a bundle of axons that send the communications between the left and right hemisphere. All right, let's look at some pictures now. Okay. So we're looking at let's start on the right-hand side, the lobes of the cerebrum. Okay. So in the light blue, you have the frontal lobe. Okay. And then in the purple area there, you have the parietal lobe. In the green area, you have the occipital lobe. Okay. And then in that salmon color, you have the temporal lobe. Okay. So all those colors are down for you at the bottom in that legend. Frontal lobe, then parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Okay. In this graphic, we can also look at some of these fissures. Okay. So the longitudinal fissure, you see how that separates the 2 hemispheres, and it runs sagittally. Not only that, but if you did a mid-sagittal plane or cut, slice, okay, it would be on that longitudinal fissure because you're separating the brain equally in half. Then you have the central fissure. Remember, the central fissure separated the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And then you have the lateral fissure, which separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and the parietal lobe. Okay. And then you have your gyri. You have the precentral gyrus, and that makes sense. Pre is before. So precentral gyrus is before the central fissure. And the post-central gyrus is going to be after the central fissure. Remember, post-central gyrus, somatosensory cortex, pre-central gyrus, motor cortex. And then you have the superior temporal gyrus. Okay, so that's the ridge just beyond the lateral fissure there. Okay, it's in the temporal lobe, and it has the name superior temporal gyrus. So it's going to be on top. Okay, so it's at the top of the temporal lobe. Okay, on the left-hand side, we have again, now remember here, what you're doing is you're looking at a coronal slice, right? So at the top. And so in here, you're looking at the corpus callosum, which is connecting the left and right hemispheres. You see again the central fissure, the longitudinal fissure. You see the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle. You see the lateral fissure. Okay, so all of those major parts of the brain are shown to you from a dorsal view, okay, on the right-hand side, a coronal view on the left-hand side. Okay, Telencephalon continued here. We have the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is the regulation of motivated behaviors. So we're talking a lot about emotions here. Mammillary bodies are part of this limbic system. And they're for memory. The hippocampus, big memory center. We'll talk a lot about that. Amygdala, emotions, especially fear. Fornix helps the hippocampus with memory. Cingulate, emotions and memory. And septum, emotions and memory. Okay, so a couple words here that might trip you up again a little bit. Hippocampus, okay, hippocampus and amygdala. Okay, and then the basal ganglia, which is our big motor system. Okay, the caudate nucleus and putamen are what we call together the striatum, and that is control of movement. And so striatum consists of the caudate nucleus and putamen. Globus pallidus, control of movement. Nucleus accumbens, control of movement. And then again, the amygdala, emotions, especially fear. So sometimes you will see a brain area in more than one system, okay? But we know where that amygdala now is located, but we're also putting it into alignment here with these specific systems. Basal ganglia being our motor system, limbic system being our emotional center. So let's look at the limbic system. Here, all those parts are provided for you again: the mammillary body, the amygdala, the hippocampus, cingulate, fornix, and septum. Okay. You'll also notice in this picture that there are oftentimes two of each. Okay. Remember, you have the left hemisphere and you have the right hemisphere. So you have a right amygdala and a left amygdala, a left hippocampus and a right hippocampus. Okay. Here, the basal ganglia. So we have the major parts again: nucleus accumbens, globus pallidus, the caudate, the putamen, okay, and then the amygdala. And it's nice here because you're seeing it in relation to other parts that we've already learned, like the thalamus. Okay, now, any way that you can access more visual aids for the brain areas, the better you're going to have, you're going to do in the class, the better you're going to have the opportunity to really consolidate this material. Okay, so I'm ending here with several different pictures for you. Again, this is a mid-sagittal slice, right? And you can practice these. You can go online. I have a lot of additional ancillary materials for you in the learning management system that you can go to. But the more that you practice these parts, it's going to be easier in subsequent chapters because you'll at least have an identification with the pronunciation of the words and a basic idea of where these different parts are located. Okay, so a mid-sagittal view, a basal view of the brain is also provided for you here. Okay. And then I ended with kind of an overall picture of the major brain structures, okay, so that you would have everything kind of in one place for you. So this is going again, if you look on the left-hand side, Telencephalon, then Diencephalon, Mesencephalon, Metencephalon, and Myelencephalon. Okay.